Welcome. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. There is nowhere you need to be for the next hour, and nothing at all that you need to do. Tonight, we are going to take a slow, quiet crossing across the North Atlantic Ocean in the company of a ship that is now more than a century gone. The ship's name is the RMS Titanic, and her story is one of the longest remembered stories of the modern age. You have probably heard pieces of it before. Tonight, we will tell it all the way through, from the first plans drawn on paper in a quiet office in Liverpool, to the calm moment when a submersible, many years later, first shone its lights on her resting place on the dark floor of the sea. You do not have to follow every detail. You do not have to remember any of it. The voice will carry on, the story will carry on, and you can simply drift along beside it, the way you might drift on a calm tide on a warm summer afternoon. We will begin not at the collision, and not at the launching, but earlier still, in an Edwardian parlour in a grand house in England, where three men sat down to dinner one evening in 1907, and quietly imagined something that had never been built before. Breathe in. And out. And we will begin. The dinner was held at Downshire House, in Belgravia, London, in the summer of 1907. The host was a man named William James Peary. He was the chairman of a great shipyard in Belfast, in the north of Ireland, and the shipyard was called Harland and Wolff. It had built ships of every kind for decades. It employed, at its peak, many thousands of men. Its enormous slipways, set along the shore of the River Lagan, were among the most famous industrial sites in the British Empire. His guest that evening was a man named Joseph Bruce Ismay. Ismay was the managing director of the White Star Line, one of the great passenger shipping companies of the day. The White Star Line had been founded in Liverpool in the 1840s, and over the years it had grown into an enormous operation, with offices and agents in every major port, and ships that sailed between Europe and America carrying mail, cargo, and a great many human beings. Over the course of the dinner, the two men discussed a problem. The White Star Line's great rival, a company called Cunard, had recently introduced two new ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. These ships were faster than anything else afloat, and they were becoming enormously popular with passengers who wanted to cross the Atlantic as quickly as possible. The White Star Line had no answer to them. It did not, in the opinion of Ismay and Peary, really want to. Racing against Cunard on pure speed was a losing game, because the engines that could produce the required power also shook the whole ship in a way that made its interior cabins, its dining rooms, and its smoking lounges into unpleasant places to sit during a crossing. Ismay had another idea. Instead of competing on speed, what if the White Star Line competed on comfort? What if, instead of building the fastest ships in the world, they built the largest and the most luxurious? What if they built something so spacious, so steady, so quietly magnificent, that a wealthy passenger would choose it simply for the pleasure of being aboard it for a week? Peary listened, and Peary agreed. By the end of the dinner, the two men had sketched, on the back of a menu card, the basic shape of three new ships. They would be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic. They would each be more than 800 feet long, which was longer than any ship ever built. They would weigh, when finished, around 46,000 tons apiece, which was nearly twice as much as any existing vessel. They would carry around 2,400 passengers each, in three classes, with the first-class accommodations rivaling the great hotels of London and Paris. And they would be designed, from the keel upward, for safety. The safety features were a matter of serious pride. Each of these new ships would have a double-bottomed hull, so that if the outer skin were somehow punctured, water would be stopped by the inner skin beneath. Each would be divided into 16 watertight compartments, separated by tall bulkheads, with heavy metal doors that could be closed from the bridge at the flip of a single electrical switch. The ship was designed so that even if four of those compartments were flooded at the same time, she could still stay afloat. No accident anyone could reasonably imagine was expected to flood more than 4. The idea of 5 compartments flooding at once was considered, and then set aside, because it could not realistically happen. A trade magazine called Shipbuilder, reviewing the new class of vessels, wrote that they were, in its judgment, practically unsinkable. The word stuck. In the years that followed, newspapers and advertisements and even ordinary passengers would sometimes simply drop the word practically and say that the ships were unsinkable. It was not a claim the White Star Line itself ever formally made. It was, rather, a word that drifted into the air around the ships, the way warm mist sometimes drifts over a harbor at dawn. Construction of the first of the new ships, the Olympic, began in December of 1908. The Titanic followed a few months later, in March of 1909. Both ships were built side by side on the enormous twin slipways of the Harland and Wolff Yard, under an even more enormous steel arch called the Aral Gantry, which had been built especially to hold the cranes and the scaffolding needed for ships of this size. The gantry was more than 200 feet tall. The men who worked beneath it, climbing its ladders in the rain and the smoke, called it simply the Big Bridge. Building the Titanic took more than 2 years and required the labor of more than 15,000 men. Riveters in leather aprons swung heavy hammers in teams of 4, driving 3 million rivets, one at a time, into the overlapping steel plates of the hull. The noise of the yard, from dawn until late at night, was a constant, rhythmic, metallic clamor that could be heard for miles across Belfast. Mothers in the streets near the shipyard sometimes said that their children learned to sleep through it the way children by a river learn to sleep through the sound of running water. On the 31st of May, 1911, the hull of the Titanic was launched. She was not yet a ship, really, in the sense of being capable of going to sea. She was an enormous empty shell, without engines, without most of her interior fittings, without the tall yellow funnels that would later become her most recognized feature. But she was already the largest hull ever placed into water. 23 tons of tallow and soft soap had been smeared along the slipway to help her slide. When the last rope was cut, she moved slowly at first, then faster, and then with a great shushing of soap and a long low groan of her plates settling, she entered the water for the first time. A crowd of more than 100,000 people watched, standing quietly in the cold Belfast air. Some of them wept. Some of them simply took off their hats. It would take almost another year for her to be completed. Engines were installed. Funnels were mounted. Interior rooms, hundreds of them, were paneled in oak and mahogany and walnut. Crystal chandeliers were hung in the first-class dining saloon. Turkish baths were tiled. The grand staircase, with its glass dome overhead, was assembled in sections and then joined together. A gymnasium with stationary bicycles and a mechanical camel was fitted on the boat deck. Long hours of careful work, by many careful hands, went into every quiet corner of her. By the early spring of 1912, she was ready. She was towed to Southampton in southern England, where her maiden voyage across the Atlantic would begin. The morning of the 10th of April, 1912, dawned cool and bright in Southampton. Passengers began arriving at the dock from about 9 o'clock onward, stepping out of trains, carriages, and motor cars, and presenting their tickets at the tall wooden gates of the White Star Line's berth. There were more than 1,000 of them in total, though many more would board later that day at 2 more ports across the channel. The Titanic herself loomed above the dock like a building turned on its side. Her 4 tall yellow funnels, each of them wide enough inside for 2 automobiles to have driven side by side, rose more than 60 feet into the grey morning sky. Her hull was black and sleek and impossibly long. People looked up at her, and their mouths opened, and they forgot for a moment to keep walking. Someone said, in a quiet voice, that she did not look like a ship at all but like a town that had somehow been taken out of the ground and laid on its side in the harbor. The passengers were divided into 3 classes in the way of ocean liners of the period. First class was a world of quiet luxury. The first-class promenade deck was paneled in fine wood and fitted with reclining chairs under long glass windows. The first-class smoking room had a stained-glass window showing a scene from mythology, and leather armchairs deep enough for a grown man to sink into and fall asleep. The first-class dining saloon was the largest afloat, stretching nearly the full width of the ship, and its carpet was so thick that footsteps across it made no sound. Among the first-class passengers were some of the wealthiest people in the world. The American businessman John Jacob Astor was aboard, traveling with his young wife Madeline. Benjamin Guggenheim, another American millionaire, was traveling with his valet and his driver. Isidor Straus, the co-owner of Macy's department store, was aboard with his wife Ida. The British journalist W.T. Stead, well known in his day for writing dramatic pieces about current events, was on his way to a peace conference in New York. A fashion designer named Lucy Duff Gordon was traveling with her husband. An artist named Frank Millet. A railroad president. A cricket player. An aide to President Taft. Second class was, by the standards of 1912, not really second class at all. Second class aboard the Titanic was roughly equivalent to first class on most other ocean liners of the day. The second-class dining saloon was carpeted and spacious. The second-class cabins had polished wood fittings and running water. Most of the passengers in second class were middle-class professionals and their families, traveling to America for work or to visit relatives. Among them were teachers, clergymen, small business owners, and a number of artisans and craftsmen. Third class, which was often called steerage in that period, was where most of the passengers were. Many of them were immigrants from the villages of Ireland, from Sweden, from Finland, from Lebanon, from Italy, and from towns across the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. For them, the Titanic was not a floating hotel. It was the road to a new life. They had sold farms, sold tools, sold small shops, saved for years, and traveled, in many cases, for weeks already across Europe just to reach the gangway at Southampton. They did not wear evening dresses or dinner jackets. They wore their best church clothes, which were, for many of them, the only good set of clothes they owned. They carried their possessions in cardboard suitcases or in bundles tied with string. They slept in bunks below the waterline, in cabins that were clean and new and better than any place many of them had slept before. By midday, most of the passengers were aboard. The gangway was lifted. Deep in the belly of the ship, in rooms none of the passengers would ever see, men in blue overalls shoveled coal into the boilers, and the pressure in the steam lines rose. Steam turbines began to spin. The great propellers, 3 of them, began to turn. At noon, the horn of the Titanic sounded 3 long, deep notes, so low that passengers felt them in their chests before they heard them in their ears. The ship began to move. As she eased away from the dock, something small and strange happened. The Titanic's enormous hull, displacing an enormous amount of water, created a suction as it moved past a much smaller American ship called the Estes. New York, which was tied up at a nearby berth. The suction pulled the New York away from its moorings, and for a moment it looked as if the two ships might collide. Quick action by the Titanic's pilot and the intervention of a nearby tugboat pulled the New York back to her dock just in time. Some of the passengers later said that they had thought, in the moment, that it was a bad omen, the way sailors always think when a near miss happens at the very beginning of a voyage. Others said nothing, because nothing, in the end, had actually happened. The Titanic continued out of Southampton water and into the English Channel. She called briefly at Cherbourg, in France, that afternoon, to take on more passengers. Then she crossed the Channel overnight to Queenstown, in Southern Ireland, where she took on her final group of travelers, most of them Irish immigrants. And then, on the afternoon of the 11th of April, with all of her passengers aboard, the Titanic left Queenstown for the open sea. As she sailed out of the harbor, a group of young Irishmen gathered on the stern to wave at the receding green hills of their country. One of them, according to the story, played a wistful tune on a set of pipes. Most of them had never seen the ocean before. None of them had any idea how far they were about to go. The first 3.5 days of the voyage were, by every account, quiet and pleasant. The sea was calm. The weather was cold but clear. Passengers in first class walked on the promenade decks, took afternoon tea in the Palm Court, attended small musical performances in the reception room, ate long elegant dinners in the grand dining saloon, and slept in large comfortable beds. Passengers in second class walked on their own deck, played cards, attended a Sunday service held in the dining saloon by a kind-faced Catholic priest named Father Thomas Biles. Passengers in third class gathered in the general room, which had a piano, and danced to Irish and Swedish folk tunes late into the evenings. The ship ran smoothly and steadily. There was very little sense of motion at all. Children slept in their bunks. The engineers, in their hot white uniforms far below the passenger decks, watched their gauges and listened to the steady hum of the turbines, and nothing was wrong. By the evening of Sunday, the 14th of April, the Titanic was about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, somewhere out in the middle of the great dark ocean, still on her first voyage, still heading west. The weather that Sunday was unusually calm. There was no wind. The sea was flat, so flat that an officer later described it as looking like a polished floor. Sailors, as a rule, do not like a completely flat sea, because it makes it harder to spot certain kinds of dangers. Waves lapping at the base of an iceberg make a faint white ring of foam around it that is visible from a long way off, even on a dark night. Without waves, there is no foam, and an iceberg can sit in the water almost invisible, especially if the moon is not out. There was no moon that Sunday night. The sky was, in the words of the men who were on deck, extraordinarily dark. But the stars were brilliant. Above the ship, the Milky Way arched from horizon to horizon in a broad pale river, and the stars were so bright and so numerous that some of the passengers said the sky seemed almost crowded. On the decks, a few night wanderers walked quietly, or leaned on the railings, and looked up at them. Down in the wireless room on the boat deck, 2 young operators were at work. Their names were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. They were not, strictly speaking, members of the ship's crew. They worked for a separate company called the Marconi Company, which had installed the wireless equipment and employed its operators. Their main job, by far, was transmitting personal messages from first-class passengers to friends and business contacts on both sides of the Atlantic. These messages were expensive, and business on the Titanic's maiden voyage had been brisk. Phillips and Bride had been working very long hours. Throughout Sunday afternoon and evening, their equipment also received a steady stream of messages from other ships in the area. Many of these messages were warnings about ice. The winter of 1911 and 1912 had been unusually mild in the Arctic, and an unusual number of icebergs had carved off the glacier of Greenland that year and drifted southward. Several ships sailing the North Atlantic that week had encountered fields of ice, some of them large. They had been sending messages to each other and to shore stations, as was the custom of the day, to let other captains know where the ice was. At least 6 separate ice warnings reached the Titanic that day. Some of them were read by the officers on the bridge and acted upon. Others, due to the busy nature of the wireless room and the informal way wireless messages were handled in 1912, sat in a pile on a small clipboard and were not always passed along immediately. One of the warnings, from a nearby ship called the Masaba, gave very specific coordinates that, had they been plotted on the ship's chart, would have shown that the Titanic was heading directly into a large field of ice. That particular message never made it to the bridge. Jack Phillips was busy sending personal messages for passengers at the time, and he set it aside to be delivered later. At about 9:40 in the evening, a message from a ship called the Californian began to come in. The Californian had stopped entirely because she was surrounded by ice. Her wireless operator began to transmit a warning to the Titanic. Phillips, who had been working continuously for many hours and was tired, snapped back. He told the Californian operator, in Morse code, to shut up, because he was busy transmitting personal messages to Cape Race in Newfoundland. The Californian operator took the rebuke quietly, and soon afterward he finished his shift, turned off his set, and went to bed. No one on the Californian would be listening to the wireless when it mattered most a few hours later. On the bridge, the officers knew there was ice in the area. But they did not slow down. This was not, by the standards of the time, considered especially reckless. The standard practice on North Atlantic liners in 1912 was that, if the weather was clear and visibility was good, a ship continued at her normal speed through known ice regions, and trusted her lookouts to spot anything dangerous in time to steer around it. The Titanic had 2 lookouts in the crow's nest, a small round basket-shaped platform mounted on the ship's foremast, high above the bow. The lookouts that night were 2 young men named Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They scanned the sea ahead of the ship, in shifts, as the cold hours of the night went by. The lookouts did not have binoculars. The pair of binoculars normally kept in the crow's nest had been locked inside a cabinet before the ship left Southampton, and the key to the cabinet had somehow been taken away by an officer who had been removed from the crew at the last minute. Fleet and Lee had scanned with their bare eyes, all the way across the North Atlantic. It had not caused any problems before. It probably did not seem to them like a serious issue. By about 11 o'clock at night, most of the passengers had gone to bed. The lights in the dining rooms had been dimmed. In the first-class smoking room, a small group of men still sat with glasses of brandy and cigars. In the second-class library, a few late readers turned pages. In third class, most of the immigrants were asleep in their bunks, dreaming, perhaps, of the coastline of America, which some of them expected to see in 2 or 3 more days. The Titanic was traveling at about 22 knots, which was close to her full speed. The cold Black Sea slipped past her hull in a steady soft rush. The stars wheeled above her. And in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet stared into the dark ahead, and waited. At 11:39 in the evening, Frederick Fleet saw something. At first it was only a darker shape within the darkness, low on the horizon ahead of the ship, where there should have been only empty sea. For a moment he was not sure what he was seeing. Then the shape grew more distinct, and he realized it was a large mass of something, close to the ship and directly in her path. He reached for the brass bell that hung in the crow's nest, and he rang it 3 times. 3 rings was the signal for an object dead ahead. Then he picked up the telephone that connected the crow's nest to the bridge, and he waited. A few seconds later, an officer's voice answered. Fleet said the words that have since become the most quoted sentence in the story. "Iceberg, right ahead." The officer on the bridge was named William Murdoch. He was an experienced Scottish seaman, the first officer of the ship, and he was standing his watch. The moment he heard Fleet's report, he gave 3 orders in quick succession. He ordered the helm hard to starboard, which in the old style of steering commands would turn the ship to port, which is to say to the left. He ordered the engine telegraph to stop, and then to full astern, which meant reversing the propellers to slow the ship as quickly as possible. And he ordered the watertight doors closed. The helmsman spun the great brass wheel as hard and as fast as he could. Deep below, in the engine room, the order was seen on the dial, and men moved to obey it, though the full astern command would take a little time to accomplish because of the way the ship's triple expansion steam engines worked. The bow of the Titanic began, very slowly, to swing to the left. For nearly 40 seconds, everyone on the bridge watched in near silence as the iceberg and the ship approached each other. The iceberg was tall, possibly 50 or 60 feet above the water, which meant that its underwater portion, following the usual proportions of ice in seawater, was likely more than 400 feet below the surface. It was, for all practical purposes, a small mountain. The bow of the Titanic swung to the left. The iceberg came down the starboard side of the ship, which is to say the right side as one faced forward. For a moment it looked as if the two might miss each other entirely. The tip of the iceberg passed the bow by a matter of feet. Then, with a strange, almost gentle sound, the underwater portion of the iceberg scraped along the bottom of the Titanic's hull. Passengers in the smoking room felt a slight tremble. Passengers in their cabins felt a faint bump, which some of them at first mistook for the ship's propeller striking something small. A few stewards hurried down corridors to investigate. In the boiler rooms, men looked up, and then looked at each other, and then began to run. The iceberg had not struck the ship head-on. If it had, the result would have been, almost paradoxically, much less catastrophic. A direct head-on collision would have crushed the bow of the ship, killed the men working in the forwardmost compartments, and probably flooded the first 1 or 2 sections. The Titanic had been designed to survive such damage. She would have limped back to New York with a crumpled nose, the way several other ships in the early 20th century had done. What had actually happened was worse. The iceberg, scraping along the starboard side of the ship below the waterline, had opened a series of small gashes and punctured seams in the steel plating. The total area of the opening was, by later calculations, probably not much more than the size of a single bedroom door, distributed along some 300 feet of the hull. It was not a huge hole. It was many small holes, stretched across 6 of the 16 watertight compartments. 6. The Titanic had been designed to survive the flooding of 4. She might, with some difficulty, have survived the flooding of 5, because the compartments toward the bow were smaller. She could not, under any circumstances, survive the flooding of 6. The ship's captain, Edward J. Smith, arrived on the bridge within a minute or 2 of the collision. He had been asleep in his cabin, which was directly behind the bridge, and the tremble of the impact had woken him. He took Murdoch's report. He walked out to the starboard wing of the bridge and looked over the railing. There was nothing to see anymore. The iceberg had drifted past and away into the dark. Captain Smith asked for the ship's carpenter to sound the hull, which meant checking the depth of water in various compartments. The carpenter hurried below. A few minutes later, the ship's builder, Thomas Andrews, who was traveling aboard the Titanic on her maiden voyage to observe her performance and make notes about improvements for future ships, also came up to the bridge. Captain Smith asked Andrews to come with him and inspect the damage. The two men walked together down through the ship, through corridors where passengers were already appearing in dressing gowns and slippers, asking what had happened. They descended to the lower decks. They looked at the mail room, where mail clerks were already trying to carry sacks of letters up to higher decks to save them from the rising water. They looked at one of the boiler rooms, where seawater was pouring in through a small opening in the hull and had already risen to the level of the men's knees. They looked at several forward compartments that were filling quickly. Thomas Andrews had designed this ship. He knew her hull and her compartments the way a man knows the rooms of his own house. He stood for a long moment in the dim electric light, and he did the calculation in his head, and then he turned to Captain Smith and said, very quietly, that the ship had perhaps an hour and a half to live. Maybe 2 hours, if they were lucky. It was then about midnight. Captain Smith walked slowly back up to the bridge. He gave the order for the wireless operators to begin sending a distress signal. And he gave the order for the lifeboats to be uncovered and prepared for loading. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. They had been placed in handsome wooden davits along the boat deck on both sides of the ship. They were made of varnished wood, and they looked very small compared to the ship herself. By the standards of 1912, the Titanic actually carried more lifeboats than the Board of Trade regulations required. The regulations had not been updated to account for the new generation of enormous ships, and the number of lifeboats that was legally required was based on an older formula tied to the tonnage of much smaller vessels. The Titanic's designers had actually planned, in early drawings, for a larger number of lifeboats. The plans had been revised downward, in part because of the appearance of the boat deck, and in part because the ship was considered so safe that a full complement of lifeboats was seen as unnecessary. The 20 lifeboats she carried, if completely filled, could hold about 1,178 people. There were, on board the Titanic that night, about 2,240. The first lifeboat to leave the ship, lifeboat number 7, was lowered from the starboard side at around 12:45 in the morning. It contained 28 people. Its capacity was 65. This would be the pattern for most of the early lowerings. At the beginning of the evacuation, passengers did not want to climb into the small wooden boats. The Titanic herself seemed safer. Her decks were brightly lit. Her lounges were warm. The orchestra, on the instruction of the captain, had gathered in the first-class reception area and was playing calm, cheerful music to reassure the passengers. People looked at the black water 40 feet below the boat deck, and they looked at the big warm ship under their feet, and most of them decided to stay on the ship. The officers, trying to follow the standing maritime custom of women and children first, began calling for women and children to come forward to the lifeboats. Men stepped back, many of them in evening dress, and watched their wives and children being helped into the boats. Some wives refused to leave their husbands, and stayed with them, and eventually died beside them. Isidor Strauss and his wife Ida were offered a place in a lifeboat together because of their age. Ida refused. She said that she had lived with her husband for 40 years, and she would not leave him now. She walked back across the deck to stand at his side. They sat down together on a pair of deck chairs, and they waited. Down on the lower decks, the ship was filling with water faster and faster. Stewards began going through the corridors, knocking on cabin doors and telling passengers to put on their lifebelts and come up to the boat deck. In third class, it was harder for passengers to reach the upper decks, because the ship had been built with physical barriers between the classes in the corridors, and because many of the third-class passengers did not speak English and could not always understand the instructions being shouted at them. Some of them simply stayed where they were, trusting that if anything was really wrong, someone would come and get them. Some of them climbed through complicated sequences of corridors and gates to reach the boat deck. Some of them were helped up by kind crew members who went looking for them. Some of them never made it. By about 1 o'clock in the morning, it had become clear to more and more people that the ship was going to sink. The bow was noticeably lower in the water than the stern. The angle of the decks had begun to tilt, very slowly, forward. The orchestra was still playing. On the starboard side, Officer Murdoch had relaxed his rules and was now allowing men into the lifeboats if there were no women or children waiting to board. On the port side, Officer Lightoller was enforcing women and children only, strictly, even when lifeboats were lowered with empty seats. The distress signal had been going out continuously. Jack Phillips in the wireless room had, at first, sent the standard code, which was CAQD. At some point during the night, Harold Bride had suggested jokingly that he should try a newer signal, SOS, which was easier to remember and easier to recognize in Morse code. Phillips had tried it. That night was one of the first times the SOS signal was used in a major maritime emergency. Several ships heard the signals. Some were too far away to help in time. But one ship, the Cunard liner Carpathia, was about 58 miles to the southeast of the Titanic, and her captain, a calm, steady man named Arthur Rostron, gave immediate orders to turn around, push his engines to the absolute maximum the boilers could produce, and drive directly toward the Titanic's position through the ice-scattered ocean at night. The Carpathia's normal top speed was about 14 knots. Captain Rostron that night managed to get her to do 17, a speed she had probably never reached before and would probably never reach again. He ordered his crew to prepare to receive survivors. He had blankets brought up from storage. He had hot soup and tea prepared. He had his ship's doctor set up a triage area in the public rooms. He had lookouts posted all around the deck to watch for ice. And then he waited for the Titanic to appear in the distance, and he drove. Meanwhile, aboard the Titanic, the lifeboats continued to go into the water. The ship was now so much lower at the bow that the forward well deck was awash with seawater. Passengers and crew began to move aft, toward the stern, instinctively seeking the higher parts of the ship. The orchestra, according to most of the survivors who remembered them, was still playing. At some point during the last half hour, they began to play a slow old hymn called Nearer My God to Thee. Not all survivors remembered this, and some said they played other tunes. But the image of the band standing on the slanting deck and playing the hymn as the ship went down would become one of the most enduring images of the story. At around 2:15 in the morning, about 2 hours and 35 minutes after the collision, the ship's lights, which had been burning steadily the whole time, suddenly flickered, dimmed, and went out. For a moment everything was dark. Then the bow went under entirely. Then, with a long, low, groaning sound that several survivors described as like a great building collapsing, the stern of the ship rose up out of the water until it was nearly vertical. Then, slowly, she began to slip downward, into the black. At 2:20 in the morning, the Titanic disappeared from the surface of the North Atlantic. The sea closed quietly over her. The stars continued to shine. For about an hour after the ship was gone, the survivors in the lifeboats could hear the voices of the people who had been in the water. There had been, at the end, several hundred of them, wearing cork lifebelts, floating and swimming in the calm Black Sea. The water was about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, which is below the freezing point of fresh water but not of seawater. A person in water that cold does not drown. A person in water that cold begins to lose body heat immediately and, within 20 or 30 minutes, passes out of consciousness from hypothermia, and then, a little later, passes out of this life entirely. Most of the lifeboats that had been lowered were not full. Many had empty seats. Several of them were relatively close to the place where the ship had gone down. A difficult question presented itself, the same difficult question that has presented itself in many shipwrecks before and since. Should a lifeboat with empty seats row back toward the place where people were in the water, even at the risk of being swamped by desperate swimmers climbing aboard? Most of the lifeboats did not go back. Their occupants were afraid that returning would mean losing what they had. One lifeboat did go back, under the direction of an officer named Harold Lowe. He had organized several boats into a small fleet, then transferred passengers among them to free up space, and then, with a nearly empty boat, rowed slowly toward the voices in the dark. By the time he got there, almost all of the voices had stopped. He and his crew pulled a few people from the water. Only a small number of them were still alive. He worked carefully and methodically, checking each body, because it was important to him not to miss anyone who still had a chance. The hour after the sinking was, for the survivors in the boats, the most difficult of all. Many of them described it as a time of almost unbearable quiet. There was no engine noise, because there were no engines. There was no wind, because the sea was still unnaturally calm. There was only the very faint sound of waves against the wooden sides of the boats, and the quiet breathing of the other passengers, and, for a while, the distant cries that gradually faded into silence as the people in the water slipped away. The survivors began to realize, slowly, how many people they had just lost. Wives looked around their lifeboats for their husbands and did not find them. Children looked for their fathers. Servants looked for their employers. Everyone who had been left alive began, at that moment, the long private work of remembering who had been with them on the ship. It was still dark. The stars were still burning. The survivors wrapped blankets and shawls and whatever spare clothing they could find around themselves, and huddled close together for warmth, and waited. At around 4 in the morning, someone in one of the boats saw a rocket, far off on the horizon, climbing into the night sky. Then another. Then the faint lights of a ship. It was the Carpathia, racing up from the southeast at her impossible 17 knots, firing signal rockets every few minutes to let the survivors know she was coming. Captain Rostron reached the scene of the disaster just as dawn was beginning to break over the eastern horizon. The light that came was a gray, soft, early morning light. By it, the survivors in the boats could see, for the first time, the enormous ice field that surrounded them. There were icebergs everywhere. Some of them were close by. They had been rowing all night in the dark, through a field of mountains of ice, and they had not known. The Carpathia stopped and began to take the lifeboats aboard, one by one. The process took more than 4 hours. Sailors from the Carpathia climbed down on rope ladders and helped the survivors up the side of the ship. Small children were placed in canvas bags and hoisted aboard. Elderly women were carried by strong young sailors. Injured men were lifted with great care. Everyone was given warm blankets and hot soup and cups of tea. Father Biles, the kind Catholic priest from second class on the Titanic, was not among them. He had given his own place in a lifeboat to another passenger, stayed on the deck with the people who remained, and led prayers with them as the ship went down. By about 8:30 in the morning, the last lifeboat had been emptied and the last survivor was aboard the Carpathia. Captain Rostron, looking down at the quiet green sea from the bridge of his ship, counted 712 human beings. That was how many had been saved. Around 1,500 people had been lost. The final numbers would differ slightly depending on the source, but the broad shape of it was clear. Of the roughly 2,200 souls who had set out from Southampton with high hopes and firm plans for the future, only 700 or so were still alive. Captain Rostron held a small service of remembrance right there on the deck for the people who had not survived. Then he turned his ship around and set a course for New York. The Carpathia had originally been bound for the Mediterranean. She had turned aside, at great expense, to answer the distress call, and Captain Rostron had decided that he should take the survivors to the nearest major port that could handle their needs, which was New York. The journey would take about 4 days. For those 4 days, the Carpathia moved slowly west across the Atlantic, carrying the survivors toward a world that did not yet know what had happened. The wireless aboard the Carpathia was small and weak, and its operator, a young man named Harold Cottam, was exhausted. He sent out only the most essential messages. Rumors began to travel across the wires of the world about what had happened to the Titanic, and many of the early rumors were wrong. Some newspapers reported that she had been damaged but was being towed to Halifax. Some reported that all the passengers were safe. The true story, in all its terrible completeness, did not arrive until the Carpathia came within range of the shore stations near New York. When the Carpathia finally tied up at a pier on the west side of Manhattan on the night of the 18th of April, 1912, nearly 40,000 people were waiting on the waterfront in the rain. Reporters, relatives, friends, clergy, doctors, and simply curious members of the public had been gathering at the pier for hours. The Carpathia's sailors lowered the gangplank, and the survivors began to come off. Some of them were met by relatives who had feared the worst, and who now wept with relief on the wet boards of the pier. Others stepped onto the shore alone, with no one waiting for them, and were taken in by strangers and charitable organizations. A little girl from a village in Ireland who had lost her mother and father and both brothers in the sinking was, by later accounts, adopted that very night by a kindly couple from Brooklyn. In the days that followed, 2 major public inquiries were held into the disaster. The first was convened in the United States, almost immediately, by a senator from Michigan named William Alden Smith. The second was convened in the United Kingdom a few weeks later, by Lord Mersey. The 2 inquiries heard weeks of testimony from survivors, from crew members, from wireless operators, from naval architects, and from anyone else who might be able to shed light on what had happened and why. Their reports, when they were published, ran to hundreds of pages, and most of the hard questions they tried to answer could not be answered with complete certainty. Both inquiries agreed, however, on a few important points. The Titanic had been going too fast for the conditions that night. The lookouts had not had binoculars. The wireless warnings about ice had not all been passed along to the bridge. The Californian, the ship that had stopped for the night in the ice field not far from the Titanic, had probably been close enough to have come and helped, if anyone aboard her had been awake at the wireless set. And the number of lifeboats carried by the Titanic, while legal under the existing regulations, had been terribly insufficient. In the years that followed, laws were changed. New regulations required that every passenger ship carry lifeboats for every single person aboard. New rules required that ships maintain wireless watch at all hours, not only when an operator happened to be on duty. the International Ice Patrol was created, a cooperative service among several nations, to monitor the movement of icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes and warn ships away from them. The International Ice Patrol still operates today, more than a century later. It has its own small ships and its own aircraft and its own radar systems, and it still tracks the icebergs that drift down from Greenland every spring. In a sense, every modern North Atlantic crossing is quietly safer because of what happened that night in 1912. The survivors went on with their lives, as survivors do. Some of them talked about the sinking for the rest of their years. Some of them refused to speak of it ever again. The last survivor who had actually been aboard the Titanic, a woman named Milvina Dean, who had been only 9 weeks old on the night of the sinking, passed away in 2009, at the age of 97. She had no memory of the event itself, having been carried aboard as an infant by her mother. But she had spent much of her life being asked about it, and she had, in her quiet way, carried the memory forward for those who could no longer carry it themselves. The wreck of the ship itself remained on the bottom of the sea, unseen and unvisited, for 73 years. It rested on a gentle sloping plain of mud and clay, about 12,500 feet below the surface, which is roughly 2.5 miles straight down. The weight of the water above her is enormous. The pressure is crushing. The water is near freezing, and dark, and very still. For decades, several different expeditions tried to find her. They knew her approximate location from the distress signals she had sent, but the ocean floor is very large, and the equipment needed to search so deep was only slowly becoming available. In September of 1985, a joint French and American expedition led by a scientist named Robert Ballard finally succeeded. They were using a small unmanned submersible called Argo, which trailed a long cable behind a surface ship and carried cameras that could see in the dark. Late one night, as Argo crawled slowly across the mud far below, it passed across the rim of one of the Titanic's enormous boilers, which had been thrown out of the ship during the sinking and had rested there undisturbed for 73 years. The researchers on the surface saw the boiler on their monitors, and for a long moment no one spoke. They found the ship herself a few minutes later. The great bow, lying upright in the mud, a field of broken glass and china and rusting metal spreading out around her in the dark, a stillness that had been there for nearly 3/4 of a century, softly lit by the submersible's lights. In the years that followed, many other expeditions returned to the wreck. Robert Ballard himself went down to her, in a small manned submersible, and placed a small commemorative plaque on her stern. Other expeditions recovered artifacts from the debris field around the ship, which was sometimes controversial and sometimes welcomed. Photographs and video and three-dimensional scans of the wreck slowly made their way into the public imagination. By the 1990s, almost everyone in the world could call to mind a picture of the Titanic at the bottom of the sea, because they had seen her on a television documentary or in a feature film. The Titanic has sat on the seafloor now for more than 110 years. She is not going to last forever. Microbes that feed on iron have been eating her slowly for decades, forming long orange icicles of rust that hang from her hull. Her upper structures have begun to collapse. Some scientists estimate that within another 50 years or so, what remains of the recognizable shape of the ship will have deteriorated beyond recognition, and she will become simply a long, low smear of iron and decay on the seafloor, quiet and dark and unremembered by the water around her. But the story of her will last much longer than her wreck. It has already lasted longer than most of the people involved could have imagined. It has been told and retold, in books and in films and in songs and in paintings and in quiet conversations around dinner tables, for more than 100 years now, and it will probably be told for a very long time still. Part of why it lasts, perhaps, is that the story holds so much all at once. It holds the ambition of a wealthy, optimistic age. It holds the courage of individual people under sudden terror. It holds the quiet grief of those left behind. It holds the gentle, stubborn lesson that the world is never quite as safe as we would like to believe, even when it looks that way on a calm and star-bright night. The ship is down there now, in the dark. The survivors are all gone. The great yellow funnels have long since fallen away. The grand staircase has long since collapsed into dust. The orchestra's music has long since ended, and the sea has long since grown quiet again above the place where she rests. If you step outside on a cold, clear night, and you look up at the same stars that were shining above her on that 14th of April in 1912, you are looking at the same sky she was looking at. The stars are the same. The sea is still there. The story, for tonight, has reached its quiet end. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.